A mountain radio set, cobbled together from spare parts and stubbornness, crackles to life on a ridge somewhere in the interior of Portuguese Timor. For months, Australia has believed these men are dead, wiped out, the way the rest of the garrison was wiped out in February. The Japanese have told the local population exactly that the last Australians on the island are gone, and resistance is finished. They are wrong. Down in the valleys and up in the mountains, roughly 400 Australian commandos are still moving, still fighting, still alive, kept in the field by Timorese guides, Timorese porters, and a homemade radio the men have nicknamed, without a trace of irony, Winnie the War Winner. When the signal finally reaches Darwin, it doesn't ask for extraction, it asks for supplies. These men aren't planning to leave. This is the story of a war within a war, one most of the Pacific conflict's histories reduced to a footnote. This is Sparrow Force. In December 1941, in the frantic weeks after Pearl Harbor, Australia sent a garrison codenamed Sparrow Force to the island of Timor. Roughly 1,400 men, built around the Tasmanian 241st Battalion, with a smaller commando unit, the 2nd Independent Company, attached and sent forward into neutral Portuguese territory to the east. The strategic logic was sound. Timor sat directly across the sea from Darwin, a stepping stone the Japanese could use to threaten Northern Australia itself. The problem was resourcing. Every division, every squadron, every ship Australia had was already stretched thin across a dozen fronts. Timor got a garrison. It did not get a garrison capable of stopping a serious invasion. On the night of the 19th of February, 1942, the same night Darwin itself was bombed for the first time, Japanese forces landed on both halves of the island simultaneously. In Dutch Timor, the main body of Sparrow Force fought a brutal 3-day battle before being surrounded and forced to surrender on the 23rd. Over 1,000 Australians went into captivity that week, headed eventually for prison camps scattered across Southeast Asia. For most of them, the war on Timor ended in those first 3 days, but not for everyone. To the east, in Portuguese Timor, the 2/2nd Independent Company had not been caught in the same trap. Roughly 250 commandos, purpose-built for exactly this kind of fighting, were already dispersed through the mountains when the surrender came through on the radio. They were joined in the following weeks by around 140 more men, soldiers from the defeated Dutch Timor garrison, who had slipped the Japanese encirclement and made their way east on foot through terrain that made pursuit brutally difficult. Together, that gave the resistance roughly 400 men. No armor, no artillery, no air support, and, for months, no confirmed contact with the outside world at all. What they did have was training built specifically for this scenario. Independent companies were designed from the outset to operate alone behind enemy lines for extended periods, living off minimal resupply and maximum improvisation. And they had something the planners in Melbourne hadn't fully accounted for: the Timorese. The mountainous, difficult terrain of the island was ideal for guerrilla warfare on its own, but it was the local population, Timorese guides who knew every goat track through the highlands, porters who carried ammunition and supplies on foot where no vehicle could follow, and civilians who fed and sheltered Australian soldiers at direct risk to their own lives, that turned 400 isolated men into a fighting force the Japanese could not simply hunt down and eliminate. Portuguese colonial officials, technically bound to neutrality, quietly allowed the Australians to use the local telephone network, giving the commandos an early warning system stretched across the island's roads and villages. Life in those mountains was its own kind of relentless. Boots wore through on volcanic rock and unforgiving jungle trails within weeks. Uniforms rotted in the humidity and were patched, then patched again, until little of the original fabric remained. Malaria and dysentery moved through the ranks as steadily as any Japanese patrol, and there was no field hospital waiting behind the lines, only whatever a unit medic could manage, with what had survived the trek in on a pony's back. Men slept where they stopped, ate what could be carried or foraged, and learned to move their camps every few days as a matter of survival rather than tactics, because staying anywhere too long was itself a death sentence. For weeks after the fall of Dutch Timor, Australian command had no idea the 22nd was still an organized fighting force. Some reports assumed they'd been destroyed along with the rest of Sparrow Force. The Japanese, for their part, told local villages exactly that the remaining Australians had been wiped out and that continued resistance was pointless. It wasn't true, and the company's own signalers set out to prove it. Working with salvaged and improvised parts, engineers and signalers within the unit built a functioning long-range radio transmitter from what amounted to spare components and sheer persistence. They christened it, with the kind of gallows humor that survives in units cut off behind enemy lines, Winnie the War Winner. When contact with Darwin was finally re-established in April, it changed everything. The 22nd was no longer a lost unit presumed dead. It was an active guerrilla force with a direct line to Australian command, one that could call in supply drops, coordinate intelligence, and, crucially, prove to the wider world that Timor had not fallen silent. From that point, the campaign took on its real shape. Hit-and-run raids on Japanese patrols and outposts, ambushes on the island's few usable roads, intelligence gathering on Japanese troop movements, and a deliberate strategy of never giving the Japanese a fixed position worth committing serious force to attack. The commandos moved constantly. They struck fast, in small numbers, and disappeared back into terrain that punished anyone trying to follow. The results, by the standards of a 400-man force with no heavy weapons, were extraordinary. Australian accounts from the period claimed a kill ratio of roughly 9 Japanese soldiers for every Australian lost in action, a figure that reflected both the effectiveness of the guerrilla tactics and the near-impossible task the Japanese faced trying to root out a mobile enemy from terrain that favored the defender at every turn. The Japanese response was to keep feeding in more troops. What had started as an occupation force grew through 1942 into a substantial garrison, by some estimates rising toward 9 battalions, more than 9,000 men, and by the end of the year climbing past 12,000. Every one of those soldiers and every unit of supply and logistics required to support them was a soldier and a supply line that could not be used elsewhere. At the exact moment, the Japanese army was fighting its way down the Kokoda track toward Port Moresby, one of the most desperate campaigns of the entire Pacific War. A division's worth of Japanese combat power was tied down on a small, strategically secondary island, chasing 400 Australians and the Timorese who wouldn't stop helping them. A typical raid gave away almost nothing beforehand. A patrol would move for hours through darkness and thick scrub to reach a position above a road or a village outpost, wait, often for most of a day, motionless and silent, watching Japanese movement to confirm timing and strength. Then, in a matter of seconds, the ambush would open. Rifle fire and grenades thrown from cover, a burst of violence over almost before it began. and the commandos would already be moving again before the Japanese could organize a coordinated response. By the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left to find but casualties and an empty ridgeline. It was a rhythm the Japanese never fully solved, exhausting to endure and nearly impossible to counter with conventional infantry tactics built for a different kind of war. Prime Minister John Curtin himself, looking back at 1942, singled the campaign out publicly, noting that Australia's guerrilla forces in Timor were doing bold work that deserved more attention than the larger, more visible battles in New Guinea were allowing it. The tactics that kept the 2nd alive and effective came with a cost the commandos themselves could not fully control. As Japanese pressure intensified through mid-1942, occupying forces began targeting the civilian population directly, punishing villages suspected of aiding the Australians, and, as the year wore on, pressuring Timorese and Portuguese communities with escalating threats to cut off the local support the guerrillas depended on. It worked, gradually. Intelligence that had once flowed freely from villages across the island began to dry up as the risk of providing it grew unbearable. By the final months of the campaign, operations that had once run on a dense local network of tips and support were becoming steadily harder to sustain. The human cost to the Timorese population over the full course of the Japanese occupation that followed was staggering. Estimates run into the tens of thousands killed, a toll that would shadow the campaign's legacy for decades, and one the documentary record does not allow to be separated from the story of the commandos it briefly sustained. It is one of the most difficult truths embedded in the campaign's success. The same mountain trails, the same village networks, the same quiet willingness of ordinary people to feed and hide and guide strangers with rifles. All of it kept 400 Australians alive and fighting for a year. But every one of those villagers who helped was also making themselves a target the moment the Japanese came looking for informants. There was no way to separate the guerrilla campaign from the communities that made it possible, and there was no way to protect those communities once the occupying force decided punishment was the only remaining tool it had left. In September 1942, 7 months into the campaign, a second commando unit, the 4th Independent Company, landed to reinforce the exhausted 2nd, bringing the guerrilla force up toward 700 men at its peak strength. It was, in retrospect, both a reinforcement and a signal that the operation's long-term sustainability was already in question. By the final months of 1942, with local intelligence networks fraying under Japanese pressure and the Australian High Command fighting equally desperate battles for New Guinea, the calculation shifted. Retaking Timor outright, planners concluded, would require at least 3 full divisions with strong naval and air support, resources Australia simply did not have to spare. Continuing to hold the island indefinitely with an undersupplied guerrilla force was no longer a sustainable strategy either. The withdrawal, when it came, was its own kind of dangerous operation. Dutch destroyers, the Tjerk Hiddes and the Van Galen, ran repeated high-risk missions through waters, patrolled by Japanese aircraft and shipping, to lift the commandos and their Timorese and Portuguese allies off the island, company by company, through December 1942 and into January 1943. A small intelligence detachment stayed on afterward, finally extracted by American submarine in February 1943, the last Allied land force to leave Southeast Asia in the entire war. Roughly 40 Australian commandos died over the course of the year-long campaign in Timor, Estimates place Japanese losses at well over 1,000. And for a full year, a force that began at 400 men and never exceeded 700 tied down a Japanese garrison that grew past 12,000. Soldiers, weapons, and supply lines the Japanese needed elsewhere at exactly the moment they needed them most. It rarely makes the highlight reel of the Pacific War, Kokoda, Guadalcanal, the great naval battles. Those are the names most histories remember. Timor's guerrilla campaign, fought by a scattered handful of commandos, and the Timorese villagers who risked everything to keep them fed, hidden, and armed, is most often reduced to a paragraph, if it appears at all. But for one full year, 400 men who refused to accept the surrender everyone assumed had already happened kept a division's worth of the Japanese army looking over its shoulder on an island most of the war's histories still don't know how to spell. This is Sparrow Force, the ghost war Japan could never quite finish. If you think stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe. There are more of them waiting.